Hello everybody and welcome to the Canadian Obesity Network's public webinar series. My name is Brad Hussey. I'm the Communications Director for the network and I'm your host for today's discussion. This series is just one of the ways the network disseminates credible and useful information about obesity to Canadians, and if you'd like to be a part of our growing public community and want to be the first to hear about future webinars, head over to obesitynetwork.ca/public, the URL you see on your screen now, and be sure to opt in for our newsletter. You can also find us on Twitter at @CanObesityNet and on Facebook at facebook.com/ConRCO. Keep in mind that an archive of this presentation will be available for viewing and sharing on obesitynetwork.ca/webinars, where you can also check out our previous editions and questions and answers that our speakers have answered for our guests. Please note that due to the extremely high volume of requests to join this presentation, we've disabled both the microphone and question and answer features. However, we do want you to be able to ask questions you might have, so if you have any and you'd like to ask our speakers directly, you can reach out via social media or in an evaluation survey that you'll see at the end of the presentation. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. Your feedback really helps us guide our future webinar topics. We have two great speakers today who are looking at a very important issue for the network and for our members. And first up, we're going to hear from Dr. Sara Kirk, who's a professor of health promotion and Canada Research Chair at Dalhousie University, where her program of research explores how we can create supportive environments for chronic disease prevention. And after Dr. Kirk, we'll hear from Dr. Angela Alberga. She's the Banting CIHR postdoctoral scholar at the University of Calgary, and her research looks at ways to reduce weight bias in healthcare, education, and public policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kirk.
Thank you very much, Brad, and hi everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to participate in this webinar, along with my colleague Angela, and to share with you some of the work that we've been involved in that's shining a light on weight bias and stigma across Canada and actually across the world. So in doing so, we're representing a group of researchers as well as some knowledge users and community advocates from across Canada who've come together to raise awareness of this important issue. We're working under the umbrella of the Canadian Obesity Network, and we're called the EveryBODY Matters Collaborative. And as I say, we're seeking to shine a light on the causes and consequences of weight bias and to spark some of the solutions for overcoming it. So we do a lot of talking in society about the rise of obesity rates worldwide, and unfortunately the dominant cultural narrative fuels assumptions that cast blame and shame upon people living with obesity. This narrative of personal responsibility minimizes the complexity of obesity and ignores the powerful forces that shape our behaviors, such as the ready availability of highly palatable food and environments that discourage physical activity. What you can see on your screen here is some work from the Obesity Society of the US, where they're looking at the potential contributors to obesity. And what you can see on the left-hand side of the box is the things that are under the control of the individual or inside the person. And then on the right of the box, you can see the things that are outside the person. And what you can see as well, that some of these are color-coded. For example, things in the pink color that are the economic environment, orange is food and beverage environment. There's things that are psychological, social. So all of these things shape our behaviors. And it's clear from this diagram that many of these are outside the control of the individual. And what's often ignored is that these forces are actually working on us all, regardless of our weight status. But we don't necessarily recognize that when we're having conversations about these kind of factors. So there's a whole mantra around eat less, move more that you'll find in health professional dialogue, within the health system, the weight loss industry, and of course within wider society. And it's those things that actually are helping to contribute to this blame and shame that many people with obesity will actually experience. And I'm using this slide with the permission of John Holcroft, who is an artist from the UK, because I think this really highlights how it feels as an individual living with obesity to just be going around your daily life, the bias and the things that people may direct towards individuals living with obesity. We don't even know that we're doing it. Ultimately, weight bias leads to stigma, which in turn can result in exclusion, marginalization, and the development of inequities. But we've known for decades about the negative impact of weight bias on people's physical and mental health, but this has not been translated into action. In fact, very few interventions to reduce weight bias have been implemented and evaluated, even though we know that the interventions aimed at shifting attitudes, beliefs and knowledge about the complex causes of excess weight gain can translate into less blaming of the individual. So we need to talk about why this knowledge to action gap exists, and we need to work to overcome it. And this is one of the things that we're really trying to do within the Everybody Matters collaborative. But currently, the finger of blame points firmly at the dominant discourse of individual responsibility. People living with obesity blame themselves for their personal failures related to weight management, and of course everyone else blames them too. Shaming tactics are widely used by healthcare providers, despite the evidence and strong evidence that they don't work and in fact may cause harm. And I believe Angela will talk a little bit more about that in her section. In my own research, we've explored weight management from the perspectives of individuals living with obesity and found that blame was a dominant theme for our participants, who blame themselves for what they perceived as personal failures related to their weight loss and inability to maintain weight loss. And this self-blame occurs despite an understanding of the fact that these things are damaging to their own emotional and psychological health. What was also very interesting in our study, we also looked at healthcare providers, and healthcare providers also blame themselves for not being able to support individuals living with obesity in the way that they would like to. So this also really kind of highlights some of the system level issues that we're dealing with that we need to be really recognizing and challenging. And words matter when it comes to discussing weight. Conversations among healthcare providers often objectify people experiencing weight challenges. For example, in our study on weight management in Nova Scotia, one of our healthcare providers was talking about how we just had a death of a 500-pounder recently, 13 weeks in ICU. That's not cheap for the province, is it? That example really kind of highlights that individuals living with obesity are often defined by their weight rather than actually sort of taking that out of the equation. Another participant talked about how if you don't keep a food diary, I won't see you again, and how that made them feel like a little child again, felt judged. These are the sort of things that often you'll hear in a consultation with a healthcare provider. That's really not helpful to individuals when they seek support from the healthcare system. And our current system is not set up to provide the supportive environment needed to address weight challenges. My own research found that healthcare providers are actually fearful to offer support because they feel that it might lead to dependency. And this slide is one where I feel that really, sort of illustrates that reaching for support, but that support being just a little bit out of your reach. Certainly our participants talked about how emotional support was an essential component of building a trusting relationship with their healthcare providers, and what they valued most about their interactions with health professionals. And although health professionals acknowledged that they needed to establish trust, often they did feel this kind of fear that by spending time with an individual who was seeking support, that relationship would not be able to end at the appropriate time. And so we really need to kind of think about how we're structuring our interactions with individuals and how that impacts our therapeutic relationships. And we need to move upstream to address weight bias, to recognise the complexity that surrounds obesity, and to protect people from the blaming narratives that persist around weight and health. It's not an easy fix. It requires changes in the very fabric of our culture, our values, and the way we live our lives. It should not be so hard to achieve or maintain good health, but as we saw earlier on, there's many things outside of the control of the individual that simply make it so hard for all of us to maintain a healthy body weight. My colleague Michael Vallis actually was giving one of the webinars, the last webinar for the network, and would have talked a lot about these kind of challenges. And one of the things that often really strikes me is that healthy behaviour is actually abnormal in our current environment, where everything around us is actually sort of telling us to eat more and move less, and then the blame then becomes very much focused on people who are unable to do that, when that's something that affects every single one of us. And there's a lot of tension within the healthcare system, tension within society around how we talk about weight. You know, from my perspective, we need to be moving upstream. We need to be moving upstream and thinking about the things that are actually leading to rising rates of obesity and actually rising rates of chronic disease. So these are things that impact us all. And, you know, but there's also that tension around, well, if we move upstream, can we still focus on supporting individuals who are seeking help with their weight challenges? And certainly that tension came out a lot amongst our healthcare providers. It's kind of feeling like it's either or rather than actually we probably need to do both, but we need to do both much better than we're doing at the moment. So it's really important that we talk about these tensions and we listen to the voices of those affected because their voices have been silenced for too long. So one of the things that we tried to do in the research that we did here in Nova Scotia was actually think about the giving voice to people living with obesity through drama. And so this is a still from our dramatic presentation, which is called Going Behind the Scenes. And what you see here is an individual living with obesity who goes to see their healthcare provider, and they talk about some of the challenges that they have with managing their weight. And what we did with this, so it basically is two actors who talk to each other. So what they're verbalizing to each other is the kind of main discourse. And what they verbalize to the audience is the sort of things that are going on in their head. So there's kind of different things happening here. And what's, again, really interesting about this was that we were able to kind of take the narratives from the participants in our studies. We did a lot of qualitative interviews with different groups of people. So we took those narratives and then we kind of, with a little bit of poetic license, we created this drama that really kind of captured some of the tensions that we were hearing. And we've now incorporated this 14-minute drama into a 3-hour workshop. And what we do in that workshop, we get students from different health courses, so really kind of going along the interprofessional learning model, to watch the drama either through video, or if we have some money attached to the work, we can actually bring the actors themselves to participate in that and do this live, and that really does work much better. But what what this does is that when we ask the audience to then start to rewrite the script. So they listen to this kind of fairly negative sort of experience that people have described to us, and then they rewrite the script so that it's a really kind of, you know, addressing some of these issues that are there. And this is work that's just one piece of a bigger picture that's really, I hope, helping to shine a light not only on weight bias, but the ways that we can reduce it. I was thrilled when I actually went into the bathroom at in my university and saw this great picture propped up in the corner of near the mirrors, where people were really trying to sort of get discussion around, you know, the importance of loving your body, and I had to take a picture of it, and now I'm using it in my presentations. And so there's evidence that there are conversations happening, and there is evidence that there are things that we can do to support individuals who are seeking support from society as well as from the health system. I'm going to hand over to Angela now, and she's going to share with you some of the work that she and others are doing, and provide some examples of the things that everybody can do to challenge weight bias and discrimination in our everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for so nicely setting the stage for me. Pun intended this time. So my name is Angela Alberga, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Calgary. And I'm currently researching effective ways to reduce weight bias in healthcare, education, and public policy. So the title of my presentation is Weight Bias, Time for Action. So now that Sarah has really articulated what weight bias is and how prevalent it is, I'm going to be discussing practical ways that we, as individuals, can help address weight bias in our everyday lives. And when I say everyday lives, I mean in our work, in our homes, in our schools, and in our relationships. I'm going to start off by starting with this slide, and I borrowed this from my wonderful colleague, Dr. Erin Cameron. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about these two images and look at these two silhouettes. On your left-hand side, a silhouette of a larger body, and on your right-hand side, a silhouette of a smaller body. And what I'd like you to do is think about the words and think about which silhouette you'd associate these words with. The first one being marathon runner. The next one being organized, knitter, junk food, canoeing, good leader, socially awkward. Now, if you associate these words with one particular silhouette, I want to challenge you for a second and mention to you, what about if I told you that the person on the left is actually my friend who's a marathon runner? So this person in a larger body is a person who loves to do marathons and has run quite a few, is really well organized, and actually does canoe trips every summer, and is really known for her leadership skills in her social circles and at school and at work. Whereas the person on your right-hand side in the smaller silhouette is actually a little bit socially awkward. She's a knitter. She does love her junk food, but she is not necessarily as socially apt as the person on your left-hand side. Now, when I mention those specific examples of my friends, you tend to wonder and you tend to reflect upon your own biases of what you had before I told you those stories. And that's actually reflective of some of our biases, beliefs, attitudes, and judgments about people just based on their body size. The problem is that there are a lot of consequences of having these types of beliefs and attitudes about people living in larger bodies. For example, these are some consequences of weight bias. So people perceiving this negative judgments or attitudes can actually have negative consequences not only on their mental health, but on their physical health as well. This includes poor body image and body dissatisfaction, low self-esteem, low self-confidence, loneliness, a sense of self-worthlessness, depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders, even suicidal thoughts and acts. And when you think about these consequences, they may actually affect behavior. And you're looking at these types of behaviors can be maladaptive eating patterns, the avoidance of physical activity for actually the fear of being shamed and blamed for just moving your body in space, and even experiencing stress-induced pathophysiology. There's been research to suggest that there's higher cortisol levels in people experiencing weight bias. And avoidance of medical care is another example of people fearing that blame and shame that Sarah was mentioning when they do go into the healthcare system and may actually want to avoid the medical system because of that type of blame and shame. So what can we all do about this? As parents, as brothers, as sisters, friends, educators, health professionals, researchers, employees, and policymakers, let's think about our everyday practices. What can we actually do in our everyday lives to challenge this type of weight bias and discrimination? The first appropriate step is really to check in with yourself. And what I mean by this is doing some sort of self-reflection upon your biases, your beliefs and attitudes about people living in larger bodies. And when I say this type of self-reflection, there's actually a test that you can do called the implicit association test. And this one can be specifically towards weight, and you can find it at this website. And I remember that when I first did this test, I was actually surprised by some of the biases that I had as well. And just knowing these biases, acknowledging them, understanding that we all typically have some biases and different attitudes, it's important to acknowledge them, reflect on them, contemplate on how we can change that so that it can actually be better for our behaviors. We also want to question the assumptions about our weight. And Sarah actually put up this slide, and I'm going to bring it up again, to suggest that look at all the potential contributors to obesity. Now, the media doesn't exactly show us this type of complicated image showing contributors to energy storage and potential contributors to obesity. Really what the media makes us believe is that weight bias is as simple as energy in and energy out, when in reality weight is much more complex. And we need to question our assumptions about weight. We need to question what we think about weight and weight management, and really understand that it is much more complex to them and take away that personal responsibility that is so blamed and shamed in our society. Now let's think about our work environment. This is just actually a Google image of a typical type of waiting room in a healthcare system. Perhaps some of you on this webinar actually work as health professionals in hospitals, clinics, or other community or recreational centers. And I'm just going to ask you to think about this. What kinds of chairs are in your waiting rooms? Do they all have armrests that don't actually accommodate bodies of different shapes and sizes? And if you take a look at the wall in the back, there's some posters there, and even on the wall on the left-hand side. What kind of posters and flyers and magazines are you actually displaying in your office? Do these magazines and posters actually promote these thin ideal messages that we see so often in the media? Or are they fat-shaming messages? And now when you think about more in the healthcare system outside of just the waiting room, what about the hospital beds and gowns and blood pressure cuffs that are used? Do you actually have different sizes that are available that would make people feel more comfortable if you have appropriate sized equipment? Now, I am giving these examples from the healthcare system, but this really applies to universities, to businesses, to recreational centers, and other public spaces. Even in your offices, do we also have chairs that don't necessarily accommodate body diversity? I ask you to think about these things, because although you may think they may be subtle, these are actually ways that can perpetuate weight bias in our built environment. Now, I want us to show you a little bit of an example from the media as well. And I'm trying to promote that we be critical consumers of media ideals. And when you take a look at this picture, this is actually Victoria's Secret's Love My Body campaign. And when you look at this image, really there is no body diversity portrayed in this Love My Body campaign. But then if you take a look at another campaign by Dove, there's more body diversity represented in this picture. But typically in the media, the problem is people of size are actually portrayed negatively as unhappy, as angry, as lazy, and frustrated. But somehow thin people are portrayed as happy, successful, and being leaders. But really what we want to try to do is be critical consumers of this, realize these types of stereotypes, and try to come up with ideas that actually fight these types of stereotypes and promote other type of body diversity. I was actually happy to see this cover of a magazine from Women's Running to actually show a woman just of a different body size, staying active and promoting health at every size and physical activity at every size. These are the kinds of examples that we want to promote more to really challenge these media ideals that we constantly see that are more on the left-hand side by that Victoria's Secret campaign. We want to be critical consumers because really what the media portrays really affects the way we think about ourselves and the way we treat others. We want to challenge these social standards of beauty and attractiveness. And I ask you this, will you really let the media dictate what it means to be beautiful and to be happy? And really, I love this picture on the right-hand side because it's this little cat looking inside the mirror and seeing himself or herself as a lion. And really what matters most is how you see yourself. The problem is, even in our own line of work, so even in research and as researchers, we've seen these types of images and language used that can be stigmatizing and that can actually promote weight bias. So if there's any researchers too listening in the webinar, let's think about our presentations and the slides that we're using and the words that we're using when we talk about weight, in our papers even that we write, and in our public presentations that we give to various different audiences. I'm asking this, can we really try to improve the language that we use when we talk about weight-related issues? I'm sure that many people have actually seen images and words that are actually suggesting that there's a war on obesity, that there's a crisis of obesity, that we must fight the crisis of obesity. These kind of wording may actually be perceived as a fight against people living with obesity. If we're using those types of words, imagine what it feels like to feel like there's a war against you, to feel like there's a crisis against people living in larger bodies. Those kinds of words can really be hurtful and harmful. And I try to think that we can challenge that narrative and really try to be more careful and much more sensitive about the words that we're using, even in our academic articles. Now, this is actually a study that was conducted by Rebecca Pohl and her colleagues in 2013, and she looked at public perceptions of weight-related language used by health providers. And she surveyed about 1,064 American adults using an online survey, and she really was asking what kinds of words are actually most stigmatizing and least motivating. And what she found, and her colleagues, was that the words fat and morbidly obese are actually deemed as stigmatizing, and the words fat, morbidly obese, and chubby were actually least motivating in terms of words and language that are used with obesity. But when we think of words that are actually least stigmatizing, the words weight, unhealthy weight, and high BMI are least stigmatizing, and most motivating were unhealthy weight and overweight. So when we think about these words, maybe we can try to use more of this type of wording when we're speaking about weight and we're speaking about obesity. This kind of wording on the right-hand side can be least stigmatizing and more motivating to people listening to this type of wording by health professionals. So we know that individual blame is really harmful, and using these kind of language is harmful and truly is not helpful. So let's be careful of the language that we're using so that we don't make these images and make this language worse for people listening. Another thing, so I mentioned a lot about language and about our built environment, but another thing to consider is the kind of images that we're using in our presentations, but also in the media. So looking at these pictures, these are actually two pictures that are quite commonly used, not only in presentations, but also in the media when there's a research article that's recently been published or there's some sort of news story about obesity. These are the kind of pictures that are used, very stereotypical and dehumanizing images. The picture on the left-hand side actually cuts off their heads, really dehumanizing the person and taking away the humanity from the people that are actually portrayed in this image. And the picture on the right-hand side is portraying simply stereotypes about unhealthy eating and sedentary behavior. It is not necessary to portray this kind of negative imagery in our presentations in the media. And so when we're doing presentations, we can try to be more cognizant about the pictures that we're using so that we're not reinforcing these negative stereotypes. There's actually a research that was done looking at content analysis of videos, looking at online news, and this is from the Red Center, and they found that 65% of videos paired with online news stories about obesity actually stigmatize adults with overweight or obesity. And 77% of those videos stigmatize youth and children with overweight and obesity. This just goes to show you how often and prevalent this is. Now let's look on a positive note and really show you that there's so many positive images that we can use to really use this in the way we speak about obesity and weight. Now the Canadian Obesity Network actually has the Perfect at Any Size gallery, and this is an image bank that is free to use. All you have to do is agree to the terms of use, and the images can be used free of charge from the Canadian Obesity Network's website. And this just goes to show you that we should not be portraying negative imagery having to do with weight, and we should be portraying people living in different sized bodies, doing various different activities without stereotyping. Another example is other images that can be used from the Red Center, and they have a similar image gallery as well, where they portray children, adults, in various different settings without stigmatizing and without stereotyping and putting shame and blame onto individuals. Now, let's think about our school environment too. So we mentioned the media and the work environment, but our school environment is also something that can perpetuate weight bias in our educational settings. Unfortunately, weight bias is actually pervasive in educational settings, and it has been shown in research that teachers too, unfortunately, have weight bias, where they perceive students who have larger bodies as thought of as lazy, less likely to succeed, more emotional compared to their leaner peers. If we look at this typical kind of classroom setting, there's posters at the back, there's books on your left-hand side near where the globe is. And if we think about the posters that we're putting up in schools, and the books, and the resources, and even the conversations that teachers are having in the teacher's lounge or in the hallways, let's be careful and sensitive about the way we're speaking about weight-related issues, and even the resources that we're using to teach children in our school settings. Here's an example of a poor resource that I would not suggest using in any type of setting. This is actually promoting children going on diets to actually feel more welcomed in society. And this is a book that I would highly not recommend ever using to promote anything having to do with healthy eating, because this is promoting a thin ideal. But really another book that can be more positive and reinforcing for loving your body and self-love and that love appreciation is this book by one of our colleagues, Sigrun, Daniel's daughter, who wrote this book, who's also a researcher, and it's called Your Body is Awesome, Showing Body Respect for Children. Now, if we're using resources that actually promote body diversity and suggest that we all exist in different shapes and sizes, this can actually be quite positive for children and really encourage us to think about the books we are teaching our children. Another example here is Teacher's Pet. This is actually a resource that you can find online. I actually got a call from an educator concerned about this type of wellness activity that her child was doing at school, because the activity was called Follow Bob the Blob as he uncovers the mystery of getting healthy. Now, there's so many things wrong with this type of wellness activity. First of all, that the activity is called Bob the Blob. What if there's a child named Bob or Robert in your class? And now all of a sudden, because of this activity, they newly have a new nickname from their classmates. So I called the organization to actually express my concerns about how this can be quite stigmatizing to children and can be quite harmful. And this actually doesn't really promote health, but it's stigmatizing people of different shapes and sizes. So I actually suggested that the research suggests that these types of images are not a good idea and this type of language is not a good idea. And the organizers actually listened to my concerns, and they changed the name of the activity to Skinner the Alien. I'm not really sure how they got to that name, but regardless, it was successfully changed. So this is just an example of showing you how if we speak up about something that we think is not helpful, then we can really make a change in terms of the resources that are used in our society and in our schools. Home is where the heart is. So we've spoken about school, we spoke about the healthcare system and in our work environment, but now let's think about our home environment and our relationships with family, friends, and our partners. These are some examples of what is known as fat talk. And unfortunately, weight and fat talk is actually a very common thing that is discussed among family, friends, and in romantic relationships. So I'm actually borrowing this slide from two of my wonderful graduate students that work with me and my supervisors that put a collection of images together that were taken from a recent commercial by Special K. And some of these examples are examples of fat talk, saying, I look fat in this, cellulite is in my DNA, I look okay from the neck up, feeling so disgusted about my figure at the moment, I have a muffin top. So these are the kinds of language that's associated with this thing called fat talk. Another common example is, you look great, have you lost weight? Another example that's commonly used in our everyday conversations with family and friends. These conversations happen all the time. They happen at parties, they happen in hallways, they happen at the changing room in Forever 21 or H&M, they happen at Tim Hortons, they happen in our family dinners. They happen all the time. And these can actually be quite detrimental because they can actually be harmful for our own body and body self-dissatisfaction. Now, what can we actually do about this kind of fat talk that is so prevalent and happens all the time? First of all, we kind of need to recognize that fat talk is quite normal in society. People do this often, but are really quite harmful. This can lead to body shaming, body dissatisfaction, and disordered eating behaviors. And what we need to do is we need to stop comparing our bodies. These kinds of conversations on the left-hand side can be detrimental to our own body love, but on the right-hand side, having more positive affirmations about our bodies and the way we look and the way we relate to others can be much more helpful and promote ourselves to feel better. We can control this conversation. We don't have to conform to this type of fat talk, but what we could do is we could intervene. When this kind of fat talk is being talked about or mentioned, we can actually mention that it must be difficult to have these kinds of thoughts, but we don't want to conform or engage in this cycle. We can empathize, we can understand how difficult it can be, and we can validate their concerns, but we can also promote the opposite so we can really positively think about ourselves. Unfortunately, TV and movies is really not an example of something that's more positive, and unfortunately, I know when I was a child, I used to love Disney World. And I used to love watching movies and going to Disney World myself, but As an adult, I've realized so much that Disney is quite a fat-shaming world, and so are many Hollywood movies. And there's quite a bit of fat talk that also happens in movies and in TV shows that happen quite often. But when we think about our children, when we think about our youth that are being exposed to these kinds of messages, what are these messages instilling? That people who have larger bodies, like Ursula in The Little Mermaid, are actually evil villains, and that people who live in larger bodies are associated with gluttony and laziness. There was also a Habit Heroes attraction that was thankfully closed down, but this promoted this type of weight bias in a Disney attraction at their site. And there's so much research to actually suggest that children as young as 3 years old already form these stereotypes about people living with obesity. So if we're constantly showing TVs, Hollywood movies, and attractions that expose these types of stereotypes, we're actually reinforcing it and not helping us challenge this discourse. So some of the efforts, unfortunately, it doesn't just exist in Hollywood and TV and movies and attractions for children, but this even happens publicly, even in our Canadian political system. I'm giving this example because this is an opinion editorial that myself along with my supervisors wrote, because we were actually outraged at an evidence where this actually happened among our health minister in Alberta, who was publicly body shamed for her weight. So myself along with my colleagues wrote this opinion editorial that was published in the Calgary Herald last year. But I just think that this is an example of ways that this happens all the time in our public discourse. But we as academics and other individuals just anywhere in other sectors of society, we have a duty to speak up. And I would encourage each and every one of you, like we've done, to speak up when these kinds of things happen. And just as a side note too, looking at this image, by the way, this is not an image that we chose to put with the media, but unfortunately this is part of the media gallery that's constantly used when talking about weight or weight-related issues. Even though I had several repeated attempts to try to get this image away, they still kept this image when portraying our article that was trying to actually combat this exact message. So just to suggest that this happens often, but we do have to speak out and do something about it. So as a team that Sarah mentioned that we're actually part of, so Sarah and I, amongst many other colleagues, wonderful colleagues across Canada, we researchers formed the Everybody Matters Collaborative under the umbrella of the Canadian Obesity Network, and we're actually doing just that. We're trying to move beyond raising awareness to creating change and really affecting changing discourse and changing societal norms to really be much more appreciating of body diversity. Now, the Everybody Matters Collaborative represents a multidisciplinary partnership of weight bias and obesity stigma researchers from across disciplines and research areas. We really want to move beyond raising awareness of the existence of weight bias and stigma to promote positive behavior, practice, and policy change amongst key stakeholders. So we've worked on a couple initiatives actually so far, and we're excited to say that this week actually we're hosting the 3rd Canadian Weight Bias Summit, and our title is really to say Moving Beyond Raising Awareness to Creating Change. So this is just one of the initiatives, and we're continuously working together to create more initiatives to enact change. Now Sarah and I really want to conclude this presentation with a pledge, and this pledge is really to ask everyone who's on this webinar and to promote this amongst our parents, our friends, our colleagues, our employees, pledging about what we will actually do to address weight bias. So I ask you this question. Think about what we've presented today and what you can actually do to address weight bias in your everyday practice, not only just in your work, but in your families and the education sector and in your public discourse amongst your friends and family. Thank you so much for listening to us today, and thank you to the Canadian Obesity Network for giving Sarah and I this opportunity. And lastly, this is just our contact information, and a very big thank you to all of you for listening and for this opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you, Dr. Alberga, and thank you, Dr. Kirk, for sharing your insights with us today, and thanks to everybody who took the time to sign up and join us. For those of you that use social media, you can tweet to us using the hashtag ObesityTalk and ask questions directly of Dr. Alberga and Dr. Kirk or of the network in general. If you're on Facebook, you can find us there and send us a message or ask us some questions. And be sure to click on the survey box that you see here, the SurveyMonkey link at the bottom of your screen. You can tell us how we did today and suggest future topics for us to discuss. Be sure to be on the lookout for an email from Eventbrite, which will discuss our next event next month, which is Wednesday, June the 29th, featuring Dr. Sean Morton. He's a Greater Toronto Area obesity expert who will be discussing obesity treatments in Canada. What are the options? You may now disconnect and close your browser window, and we hope you have a great day.